Hello participants, and welcome to my presentation on EDI in science communication. We're going to focus on concepts of awareness and respect, and in the next slide I'll do a short video introduction. Hi, my name's Dana Mount and I'm an Associate Professor of English and Environmental Studies here at Cape Breton University. I've got an MA in Women's Studies and a BA in Environmental Studies, a PhD in Cultural Studies. So I've spent a lot of time in these interdisciplinary realms learning and thinking through issues of equity, social justice, inclusion, race and racism studies. And today I'm going to talk to you about how it might look like to take an EDI approach to your science communication. So what we're not going to try and do is trying to turn you into an EDI expert overnight, or to ask you to take on a set of language or a stance that might not be comfortable for you at whatever stage you're at. Instead, what I'll do is show you, I give you a few frameworks for thinking about EDI in terms of communication and walk you through those. And really, I'm going to focus on developing self-awareness, awareness of the medium, the cultural context, the audience, etc., as well as just laying out a platform for respectful communication so that you become the kind of speaker that people feel comfortable around. And when there's that level of comfort, then we've got a really positive channel for communication. So I will walk you through a PowerPoint that I've prepared that's going to focus on the elements of self, purpose, audience, medium, and cultural context. And I'll end with a few lessons learned from maybe what not to do as well. Thank you so much. Good luck with your learning. I wanted to differentiate between EDI and science communication, which this presentation is focused on, and EDI in your science project or in a proposal. That's something we can work on at another time and requires another kind of look. So if you're looking for how to integrate an EDI statement into your project proposal or into your project plan, then you might still find some of these tips useful. But today we're really focusing on the communication strategy and how you can bring levels of awareness and respect into that. When I teach writing courses, I always get students to think about what we call the rhetorical situation. And that means all of the elements that feed into each instance of writing, or in our case, each instance of communication. So for our purposes today, I've divided them into 5 categories. We'll think about the self, so who you are in particular relation to the instance of communication that you want to think through, what the purpose of that communication is, who's the intended or expected audience for that communication, what medium you're using, so are you doing a PowerPoint like me, will you be doing an in-person presentation, is this a scientific report, etc. And then what are some overall cultural context pieces that undergird all this? So those can be a bit trickier to assess in each case, but we'll lead through some ways of thinking about it. One of the first steps in the arena of EDI is to do some self-work, some self-reflection. I want you to think for a minute about your own identity and its complexity. When I ask you to identify yourself, what words come to mind? I think, for instance, about myself as a woman, as a mother, as a professor, as a teacher. If I think longer or harder about the categories to which I fit in and am ascribed, I think of my whiteness, think of my sexuality, I think of how people view me, I think of my identity as a Canadian, as a Cape Bretoner. Think for a minute about the difference between your visible identity, so how you might be read by others or outsiders, and about your invisible identity, those elements which you feel strongly about, or which you know form your identity, but which may not be immediately read by outsiders. These are the parts of your identity that you can choose to represent in different forums or not. It's very complex. Which elements of your identity do you feel most strongly connected to? And how might that differ from how others see you? Feminist theory introduced the idea of intersectionality, which helps represent the complexity of our identity and helps to demonstrate how certain identities overlap in areas of intense stereotyping, discrimination, and bias. This means that some people experience much greater discrimination, maybe harassment, lack of opportunities, abuse, bias, due to the intersection of their complex identities. Some things can be tough to acknowledge about ourselves, and this self-reflection work should lead us to thinking about these, such as our privilege and our own biases, for instance. There are lots of great tools out there to help you do a check-in on your own biases, so I'll put a link to those at the end. Other things can be great to embrace. What power to improve the situation does our privilege bring us, for example? As researchers, we often have real advantages, real access to opportunities, for instance, such as speaking up. We often have a platform, hiring students, training and mentoring others, partnering with different groups, institutions, or faculty members. It may be about acknowledging and giving credit to others, etc. And we'll consider some of those options in our talk today. Finally, I want you to think about yourself as part of what you communicate. What markers of yourself will come through different mediums? For example, visual, oral, etc. If you're recording your voice, like me, how do people read your voice? If you're having a video of yourself, what do people see when they see you? I don't want us to get bogged down in thinking about this, but it is part of our communication message. And how do you want to craft a message about yourself at any given time? When might it be useful or desirable to talk about the less visible aspects of your identity? Well, this will depend on the type of communication, the purpose, and the audience. A key question to every instance of communication is, what is the purpose? For example, are you going to a conference to network and meet connections for potential jobs or projects? Are you writing an article so that you can report on findings? Are you going into a classroom to teach? Are you at a community hall to inform the public? Are you looking to impress, or do you have something urgent that you need to alert the public to? I want you to think about your role as related to purpose. Are you there? Are you communicating as an expert or as a teacher? Are you maybe somewhere as a learner or a supporter? You need to think about your role, and in what aspect of your role have you been invited, or have you organized something, this communication instance. This will also help you think through what parts of yourself you want to share. We talked a lot about yourself as part of the communication. And it may be that in the classroom, you feel like you do want to talk about certain elements of yourself. For instance, I'm often talking about my kids in my classroom. If I'm trying to make a point about maybe teaching or rhetoric, or about seeing my discipline through their eyes as we talk about, nature or trees or something like that, or as we learn to read together. But then I might choose that at a conference where my goal is more to impress and report, that I choose not to talk about those elements of my identity. You might be the opposite, and you might choose to emphasize your identity at a conference and keep it private in a classroom. So the purpose doesn't dictate what you share, but it should be part of the question you ask yourself in terms of the sharing of your identity, or how you present your identity. In addition, thinking about the purpose really gives you an opportunity to think about the how you communicate, the tone that you use, your use of body language, and your use of diction to match the purpose of your communication. Of course, we all already do this. You write an email differently than you write an article for publication, for instance. But I'll talk to you in the next slides about how we might think of tone, language, etc., specifically related to EDI a bit more closely. And this is especially true when it comes to thinking of our audience. We spoke about the importance of self-reflection and thinking through our own identity and positionality. But it's also really important to think about the audience. And you know this instinctually. For instance, you know that you need to change almost everything about your communication strategy if you're talking to an international conference of your peers, or if you're presenting to a grade 5 class for science fair. So naturally, you would change the content, the goal of the communication, the purpose. You would change the language accessibility. You would reduce the jargon, and you would ask the teacher in advance what to expect about the class, their knowledge, their background, whether they've had a science speaker in before. And that's really the best advice, is ask the person organizing the event or organizing the medium of communication what to anticipate about the audience. The danger of overthinking your expectations of the audience is that you will make a prejudicial bias or assumption about what they know or who they are. And the really important thing when communicating to an audience, especially if it's not an audience of your peers, is that they feel heard by you, and that they feel like you acknowledge that they're ready to get the best out of this communication. So it's about meeting each other with those best expectations, but also preparing yourself to deliver something that they can really absorb. So it's about choosing suitable examples, using accessible language, adjusting or emphasizing your body language, having clear speech. Most of us at CBU have had the fun opportunity over the last number of years of learning to adjust ourselves to the various audiences that we teach to. Maybe a class of predominantly international students, maybe predominantly from one country, or predominantly domestic, maybe the Ontario athletes. So we know a bit about adjusting things like local references or global references to different audiences. So I feel like a lot of us have got some more experience there and are feeling a bit more confident in delivering really respectful content in the right way to the right people in a manner that the audience feels respected, which is really key. Thinking about the medium or method of communication gives you lots of opportunities to improve accessibility and inclusivity of your work. You might think of a traditional scientific paper and your question of whether you want to make it open access or not. Open access is a way of increasing the inclusivity of your communication because it makes the paper accessible to such a larger number of readers. You also always probably think of the audience when you think of a paper because different journals have different target audiences. For instance, you might have a paper on a foundational science topic for a highly specialized journal, and then you might also create a spin-off paper related to that for an applied health journal. So the audience is going to be very different for both, and you would naturally alter your writing topic, etc., based on that. Now, things like a virtual conference give lots of opportunity as well for thinking about how to make our work more accessible. You might think in terms of sound, clarity of recording, text, whether the slides you're making have good enough clarity, whether you're going to provide descriptive images, etc. For instance, for this presentation, I'm going to have to go back and make sure that I can capture my recorded voice in textual form so that it's accessible in that manner as well. If you're doing an in-person presentation, you might have considerations about the room. You know, is it accessible through a motorized door? Is there elevator access or ramp access to the room you're presenting in? Is there handicap parking nearby? Is the sound quality good enough for people who may be hard of hearing? Is the lighting strong enough? Is the lighting too strong? What does the venue itself say, represent, stand for, and where is it placed in the city or in the region that you want to be talking? Although the presentation or paper you're giving is focused on your own STEM research, all of your research and your living occurs within the broader cultural context. And it's really helpful to think through what some of the main themes of our current cultural context is when you're trying to develop a plan for inclusivity in your work, in your communication. So you might want to reflect on what some of the major social movements have been lately and how you might think of a nod towards recognition in your work. For examples of important social movements lately or events lately have been the Idle No More movement, a rising of Indigenous people in Canada and the States around issues of environmental stewardship, as well as in response to a lack of concern or a lack of action around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. We've also seen, of course, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in the States. This was massive, in Canada quite significant as well, which saw Black and people of color leading a charge against structural and systemic racism, and in particular against police brutality. We've also seen the rise of trans movement, which is recognizing trans visibility and acknowledging trans issues as another important element of the LGBTQ community, and making sure that that things like our language recognize a greater spectrum of gender and sexual expression beyond that of the standard binary. We've also had, as part of this global pandemic, a real suspicion growing around science, as well as a growing reliance on the global health regime. So we've seen the rise of the anti-vaxxer movement, for example, and its sort of prevalence in developing anxiety around science. So I think that those four events and movements are good starting points to think of what does that mean for you communicating in science, and how might you make small or significant reference to this in your own work in a meaningful way. So for one, I suggest you might think about whether a land acknowledgement is appropriate for what you're doing. A land acknowledgement, and I can give you a link at the end, is a way of respectfully acknowledging that the nation state of Canada was built on expropriated or rather stolen Indigenous land, and is a reminder of the contested histories of land ownership and nation building here. Land acknowledgements have their own detractors, so it's worth doing some research in terms of whether that's a statement that you want to make and the way you want to make it. Relating to things like the Black Lives Matter movement, that might seem really far from what you're trying to do or your focus on a STEM piece of STEM research, but you might think about what ways can you amplify non-white voices in terms of, say, giving credit to other researchers or the sort of history of arms of science that have come into getting you where you are today. So it might just be about specifically naming the contributions of Black scientists or scientists of color in your work. You might also definitely want to think of your use of pronouns and language, whether you want to say he, she, or they, or adopt they. I can give you some references at the end that can help you think through how to do this in a comfortable and confident manner that allows you to continue speaking in a way that feels suitable to you, but also is respectful of people's needs to be included and acknowledged. Also, anytime you're speaking publicly or sharing about STEM, it's a great time to think about how you want to represent science and what science does, right? Science as a process, scientists as a collaborative community. The real emphasis that the pandemic has put on sharing data and on open access, and thinking about representing science in that in a way that has equity as a goal and global public health as a goal. So those are a few ways that you can think through the cultural context and subtle or overt ways that you might want to communicate your respect of these in your communication. I really want to say that the most important thing for communicating is to be comfortable being yourself and focus on sharing the knowledge that you've been asked to share. Again, unless you've been asked to speak on a panel about, say, women in science, you're usually probably going to be asked to speak about your topic of expertise. So anything that you can do to acknowledge or contribute to equity, diversity, and inclusion is added value to your communication. It doesn't have to become the sole focus of it. You've already got something great to share, teach, or explain, and that needs to remain your focus. So know that you've got a contribution to make, and that by thinking through these elements that I've shared with you, it's a way of sort of rounding out and giving a nod of respect to the way we're trying to move forward as a society, and that you can do that while still focusing on your science. Like I said in the last slide, the really important thing is to know who you are and what you have to contribute, and to make that contribution with confidence and with respect for your audience. You probably don't want to spend too much time sharing the self-reflection piece to the point where it drowns out your STEM message, nor do you want to overdo your emphasis on your presumed knowledge of the audience, because that can really backfire and alienate them, especially if it ends up being, say, singling someone out in the audience or making assumptions about your audience that can be distancing. So again, focus on your message, but know yourself and have thought through in advance a lot of the elements around inclusivity, equity, and diversity that can help promote the best relationship between you and your audience, that can get your message heard and that can affirm everyone through your communication. Best of luck. Thanks so much.